A man put his hands on Bumpy Johnson's wife in broad daylight. Harlem held its breath. Because when Bumpy moved in silence, the message was always louder than the scream. Chapter 1. The Untouchable Line. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Lenox Avenue. Middle of the day. People everywhere. A man named Vincent Cole walked up to Mamie Johnson while she was coming out of a fabric store on 135th Street. Vincent worked muscle for a crew trying to move into Harlem from downtown. White money, outside interest, the kind of operation that didn't understand how things worked up here. They thought power was volume. They were wrong. Vincent grabbed Mamie by the arm. Hard enough to leave marks. He said something about her husband. Something about debts. Something about respect. Then he shoved her. She hit the sidewalk, her packages scattered across the pavement, and Vincent Cole stood there, chest out, like he'd just claimed territory. Nobody moved, not because they didn't care, because they knew what was coming. You don't touch Bumpy Johnson's wife and walk away clean. That's not how Harlem works. That's not how he works. Within 10 minutes, 5 different people had sent word. Bumpy was 3 blocks away, sitting in a barber shop on 7th Avenue, getting a shave, listening to jazz on the radio, relaxed. A kid came in, out of breath, face tight with fear. He whispered something to the barber. The barber stopped mid-stroke, looked down at Bumpy, hesitated. "Go ahead," Bumpy said, eyes still closed. "Say it." The barber leaned in. Told him what happened, who did it, where it happened. Bumpy didn't move, didn't open his eyes, didn't say a word. The barber finished the shave in complete silence. When it was done, Bumpy sat up slowly, wiped his face with the hot towel, and folded it carefully and set it on the armrest. He looked at the kid. "She hurt?" "No, sir." "Shaken up. But she's home now." Bumpy nodded. Then he stood, put on his hat, straightened his collar, and walked out. Calm, controlled, terrifying. Because everyone in that barbershop knew, when Bumpy Johnson moves in silence, the whole city feels it. And Vincent Cole had just crossed a line that didn't have a way back. Chapter 2. The Weight of the Name. By 1946, Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a name in Harlem. He was infrastructure. He didn't run the streets the way most men did. He didn't need to. While other criminals built empires on fear and bodies, Bumpy built his on something harder to break: loyalty. He controlled the numbers, the policy racket, the flow of money through every corner store, barbershop, and backroom card game from 110th Street to 155th. But that wasn't what made him untouchable. What made him untouchable was this. He protected the neighborhood. When outside crews tried to muscle in, Bumpy pushed them out, quietly, efficiently, without turning the block into a war zone. When cops got too greedy, Bumpy made sure they understood the cost of overreach. When someone in the community needed help, rent, bail, a job, Bumpy made a call. He didn't do it for applause. He did it because power without responsibility is just chaos. And Bumpy Johnson hated chaos. People trusted him because he kept the balance. He didn't prey on his own. He didn't let others do it either. That's why what Vincent Cole did wasn't just an assault. It was an announcement. It said, "We don't respect your rules. We don't fear your reputation. Nah, we're coming for what's yours." And if Bumpy let that stand, if he let a man put hands on his wife in broad daylight and did nothing, every crew from the Bronx to Brooklyn would see weakness. Every cop on the take would renegotiate. Every young hustler looking to make a name would think Bumpy's time was over. Mamie wasn't just his wife. She was the line between respect and invasion. And Vincent Cole had just stepped over it in front of witnesses, in front of Harlem. That's what made it unforgivable. Not the violence, the disrespect. Because in Bumpy's world, respect wasn't optional. It was the foundation. You could negotiate money, you could negotiate territory. But respect? That was non-negotiable. And Vincent Cole was about to learn the difference between a gangster and a king. One makes noise, and the other makes examples. Bumpy Johnson had spent 20 years building something most men couldn't even understand. Not an empire, a system. And systems don't collapse because of one disrespectful enforcer. They adapt. They respond. They remind everyone why the system exists in the first place. Bumpy went home that night. He sat with Mamie, made sure she was okay, didn't raise his voice, didn't make promises, just listened. And when she finally asked him what he was going to do, he looked at her with those calm, unreadable eyes and said, "What needs to be done?" That was all. No threats, no theater, just certainty. Because Bumpy Johnson didn't need to convince anyone he was dangerous. Harlem already knew. And now, Vincent Cole was about to find out. Chapter 3. The Silence Before the Storm. Wednesday came and went. Nothing happened. Vincent Cole woke up that morning expecting retaliation. He kept his gun close, stayed off his usual corners, watched every shadow. But Bumpy Johnson didn't show. No crew rolled up, no threats, no messages, just silence. By Thursday, Vincent started to relax. Maybe Bumpy was getting old. Maybe the stories were exaggerated. Maybe the legend didn't match the man anymore. Vincent went back to his routine, started talking again, started laughing. He told his crew Bumpy was finished, said the old man didn't have it in him anymore, said Harlem was open territory now. His boss, a connected Italian operator named Sal Moretti, heard the report and smiled. This was exactly what they wanted. For years, they'd been trying to move into Harlem's numbers game. The money was too good to leave in black hands. But Bumpy Johnson had been the wall they couldn't break. Now that wall was cracking. Sal told Vincent to keep pushing, test the boundaries, see how far they could go. But what Vincent didn't understand, what Sal didn't understand, was that silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Bumpy wasn't hiding. He was watching. While Vincent bragged in bars and on street corners, Bumpy was 3 steps ahead. He knew where Vincent lived, knew his routine, knew which crew he ran with, who paid him, and why he'd been sent. He knew Vincent wasn't the real problem. Vincent was a messenger, and you don't kill the messenger. You send one back. Bumpy spent those 2 days doing what he always did, listening. He sat in the back of a social club on 139th Street, played cards, drank coffee, let people come to him. And they did. No, a policy runner told him Vincent had been flashing money buying drinks, acting like he owned the block. A bartender told him Vincent had been asking questions, who was still loyal to Bumpy, who might be willing to switch sides. A beat cop, one of the few Bumpy still trusted, told him Sal Moretti's crew had been scouting locations for new gambling rooms. They weren't just testing Bumpy. They were planning a takeover. And Vincent Cole, loud, stupid, arrogant Vincent, was the opening move. Bumpy took it all in, didn't react, didn't rush, just nodded. Thanked people. Kept his face neutral. But inside, he was building something. Not rage, clarity. He knew exactly what needed to happen. Not a war. Wars were expensive. Wars brought heat. Wars destabilized the neighborhood. What Bumpy needed was a demonstration, something public, and something undeniable, something that would send a message not just to Vincent, but to Sal and to every other crew watching from the outside. A message that said, Harlem is not for sale. By Friday morning, Vincent Cole was walking around like he'd already won. He went back to Lenox Avenue, same block where he'd shoved Mamie. He stood there, smoking a cigarette, talking to 2 other enforcers from Sal's crew. Laughing. People walked by and avoided eye contact. Not out of fear of Vincent, out of pity. Because everyone in Harlem knew what Vincent didn't. When Bumpy Johnson goes quiet, it's not because he's weak. It's because he's decided. And once Bumpy decides, there's no negotiation. No second chances. Just inevitability. That afternoon, word came through the grapevine. Bumpy was coming. Not with a crew. Not with guns. No, just him. Walking. Calm. Heading straight for Lenox Avenue. Vincent heard the whispers and laughed them off. But his hands started shaking just a little. And by the time the sun started to set, Vincent Cole realized something most men learn too late. Silence isn't the absence of power. It's the sound of power deciding how to speak. And Bumpy Johnson was about to make himself very clear. Chapter 4. The Public Lesson. Bumpy arrived just before 6 o'clock. No entourage, no theatrics. Just a man in a clean suit walking down Lenox Avenue, like he was heading to church. Vincent saw him coming from half a block away. The street didn't empty, but it shifted. People slowed down, stopped talking, turned to watch. Nobody left. Because this wasn't about danger. This was about justice. And in Harlem, justice had a face. Vincent stood his ground. He had to. His boys were watching. Sal's reputation was on the line. He flicked his cigarette into the gutter and squared his shoulders. Bumpy stopped 3 feet away. Didn't say anything at first, just looked at him. Vincent tried to hold the stare, tried to look tough. But something in Bumpy's eyes made his stomach turn. It wasn't anger, it was certainty. "You put your hands on my wife," Bumpy said, quiet, even. No accusation in his tone, just a statement of fact. Vincent swallowed. "She was in the way. I was delivering a message." "From who?" "That's business." Bumpy nodded slowly. "So, you work for Sal Moretti." Vincent's jaw tightened. He didn't confirm it, didn't deny it. Bumpy took one step closer. "Let me tell you something about business, Vincent. Business has rules. You break the rules, you pay the price. That's how it works everywhere. Brooklyn, the Bronx, Chicago. Doesn't matter." He paused. "But Harlem? Harlem's different." Vincent tried to look unimpressed. "Yeah? How's that?" "Because here, the rules aren't about money. They're about respect. And respect isn't something you take. It's something you earn." Bumpy's voice didn't rise, didn't sharpen. It just settled, like weight. "You didn't earn anything, Vincent. You just made a mistake." Vincent's hand drifted toward his waistband. Bumpy saw it, didn't move. "You pull that gun," Bumpy said, still calm, "and you'll be dead before it clears leather. Not by me, by them." He nodded toward the crowd. Vincent looked around. 30, maybe 40 people. Watching, waiting. Old men, shopkeepers, women with groceries, now a couple of kids on the corner. None of them looked away. And Vincent realized in that moment what Bumpy had known all along. This wasn't a fight. It was a trial. And the jury had already decided. "You embarrassed my wife," Bumpy said. "In front of her community, in front of people who respect her, who respect me." He let that sit. "So now I'm going to embarrass you." Vincent's breath caught. "What? Get on your knees." The words hung in the air like a sentencing. Vincent's face went pale. "You crazy? I'm not—" "You got two choices," Bumpy interrupted. Still quiet, still controlled. "You kneel, apologize, and walk out of Harlem tonight. Or you fight me here, now, in front of everyone. And when I'm done, you won't walk anywhere." Vincent looked around again. No one was coming to help him. Not his boys, not Sal's crew. And because everyone understood the math. This wasn't about pride anymore. It was about survival. Vincent's knees buckled. Slowly, shaking, he lowered himself to the pavement. The street was silent. Bumpy looked down at him. "Say it." Vincent's voice cracked. "I'm sorry." Louder. "I'm sorry." Bumpy crouched down. Eye level now. "You go back to Sal Moretti. You tell him Harlem isn't for sale. You tell him what happened here. And you tell him if he sends anyone else, I won't be this kind." He stood, looked at the crowd. This man disrespected someone I love. And now he's answered for it. That's how we do things here. That's how we've always done things. He looked back down at Vincent. "Get up. Walk south. Don't stop until you're out of Harlem. If I see you again, we won't have a conversation." Vincent scrambled to his feet. Didn't look at anyone. Just turned and stumbled down the street. Bumpy watched him go. Then he adjusted his hat, nodded to a few familiar faces in the crowd, and walked in the opposite direction. Calm, unbothered, untouchable. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. Because what just happened wasn't entertainment. It was a reminder, a reset, a line redrawn in the sand. And everyone who saw it understood. Bumpy Johnson didn't need violence to be feared. He just needed to be present. And in Harlem, his presence was law. Chapter 5. The Message Sent. Vincent Cole didn't go back to Sal Moretti that night. He went to a bar in the Bowery, drank until he couldn't feel the shame anymore, tried to convince himself it was strategy, not cowardice. But by morning, Sal knew everything. Word traveled fast, and in their world, humiliation was currency. Sal called Vincent into a back room on Mulberry Street. Didn't yell, didn't threaten, just looked at him with cold, calculating eyes and said, "You knelt." Vincent tried to explain, tried to make it sound reasonable. But Sal wasn't interested in reasons. He was interested in results. And the result was this. Bumpy Johnson had made a fool out of his operation in front of the entire neighborhood. Sal had two options. Double down, send more men, escalate, turn this into a war, or pull back. He chose the latter. Not because he was afraid of Bumpy, because he was smart. War in Harlem meant bodies. Bodies meant police. Police meant interruptions in business. And business, real business, didn't care about pride. It cared about profit. Sal had been testing the waters, seeing if Bumpy's grip was slipping. Now he had his answer. It wasn't. So Sal Moretti pulled his people out, quietly. No announcements, no apologies. Just a strategic retreat. Vincent Cole was sent to Philadelphia, not as punishment, as erasure. He disappeared from the conversation entirely. And just like that, the threat dissolved. But the message, that spread. Within a week, every crew from the Bronx to Brooklyn knew what happened on Lenox Avenue. They knew Bumpy Johnson had faced down an armed man without raising his voice. They knew he'd forced a public apology without spilling blood. They knew he'd dismantled an invasion without firing a shot. And that was more terrifying than any execution. Because executions are final. They close the book. But humiliation? Humiliation lives forever. It becomes legend. And legends have power. Bumpy understood this better than anyone. He knew that killing Vincent would have made him a martyr, would have given Sal justification to escalate, would have brought heat from the police and attention from other crews looking to fill a power vacuum. But humiliating Vincent, breaking him in front of witnesses, that sent a different message. It said, I don't need to kill you to end you. It said, I control this game so completely, I can choose mercy and still win. It said, if you come for me, you won't die. You'll just wish you had. That's the kind of power that doesn't fade. That's the kind of power that builds dynasties. Within 2 weeks, 3 different crews reached out to Bumpy. Not to challenge him, to align with him. They offered tribute, asked permission to operate in adjacent territories, requested his counsel on disputes, because Bumpy had just reminded everyone what real authority looked like. It wasn't loud, it wasn't bloody, it was inevitable. But the message didn't just reach criminals, it reached the community. The same people who'd watched Vincent kneel started telling the story. Not as gossip, as testimony. In barbershops, they talked about how Bumpy handled it with control. In church basements, they talked about how he protected his wife without turning the block into a battlefield. In living rooms, mothers told their sons, that's what strength looks like. Not rage, not recklessness, discipline. Because Bumpy hadn't just defended his family, he'd defended the neighborhood's dignity. No, he'd shown that you didn't have to accept disrespect to avoid violence. That you could stand your ground and still keep the peace. That power didn't have to destroy to be real. And for a community that had spent generations being disrespected by police, by outside interests, by a system that treated them as less than, that lesson mattered. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a gangster. He was a standard. And the story of what he did to Vincent Cole became a blueprint. Young men started carrying themselves differently. They stopped confusing aggression with authority. They started understanding that the loudest man in the room was rarely the most powerful. That respect wasn't taken. It was commanded. And commanding it required something most people didn't have. Self-control. Bumpy had spent 2 days in silence, not because he was scared, but because he was thinking, planning, measuring, deciding on the exact response that would solve the problem without creating 10 new ones. That's what separated him from everyone else. Most men reacted. Bumpy responded. And his response was always proportional, precise, and final. No loose ends, no unnecessary bloodshed, no wasted energy, just clarity. Vincent Cole had attacked his wife, expecting chaos. What he got instead was a masterclass in controlled dominance. And the people who witnessed it, who spread the story, who internalized the lesson, they became part of Bumpy's infrastructure. They weren't his soldiers. They were his believers. And belief, in the end, is stronger than fear. Fear makes people obey. Belief makes them protect. So when outside crews thought about moving into Harlem, they didn't just think about Bumpy's reputation. They thought about the thousands of people who'd stand with him. Not because they were paid, because they were invested in the neighborhood, in the principle, in the man who'd proven again and again that he put the community first. That's why Sal Moretti pulled back. That's why Vincent Cole disappeared. That's why Bumpy Johnson's grip on Harlem didn't just hold, it tightened. Because the message wasn't just about one man kneeling on Lenox Avenue. It was about a system that worked, a system built on respect, restraint, and loyalty. A system that didn't need violence to function, but could deliver it with surgical precision when necessary. And everyone, from the corner boys to the connected Italians downtown, understood one simple truth. You don't fight a system. You either join it, or you get out of the way. Bumpy Johnson had built something most men spend their whole lives chasing and never find. Inevitability. Not through force, through presence. And that presence, calm, unshakable, certain, was now etched into the concrete of every block in Harlem. Vincent Cole was just a reminder, a footnote in a much larger story. The story of a man who controlled an entire neighborhood without ever needing to raise his voice. Because when you've built something real, something rooted in principle and loyalty, you don't need to shout, you just need to show up. And when Bumpy Johnson showed up, the whole city listened. Chapter 6. The Legacy of Restraint. Years later, people would still talk about that evening on Lenox Avenue. Not because of what happened, because of what didn't. No gunshots, and no ambulances, no police tape. Just a man on his knees and another man walking away. And somehow, that quiet moment carried more weight than 1,000 bullets ever could. Because Bumpy Johnson had done something most criminals never figure out. He'd turned restraint into legend. In a world where reputation was built on body counts and fear, Bumpy had taken a different path. He'd built his on control. And control, real control, was rarer than any diamond, more valuable than any territory, because anyone could pull a trigger. But it took something else entirely to choose not to. That choice, made in front of witnesses, in broad daylight, on a block where respect was the only currency that mattered, that choice became the foundation of everything that followed. It became the story people told their children, and the example they pointed to in explaining what real power looked like. The moment they referenced when someone got too loud, too reckless, too desperate to prove something. They'd say, "You remember what Bumpy did to that man from downtown?" And the conversation would shift. Because everyone remembered, and everyone understood what it meant. In the months after Vincent Cole left Harlem, something interesting started to happen. The neighborhood stabilized. Not because Bumpy cracked down harder, because people believed harder. They believed in the system he'd built. They believed in the protection it offered. They believed that as long as Bumpy was in charge, Harlem would remain theirs. The numbers game kept running. Money kept flowing. But the violence that plagued other neighborhoods, the shootouts, the turf wars, the bodies left in alleys, that stayed outside. Bumpy had created something most gangsters never achieve: peace through strength. Not the absence of violence. The option of violence, held in reserve, deployed only when absolutely necessary. Like a weapon you never have to draw because everyone knows it's there. That's what the Vincent Cole incident had reinforced. Bumpy didn't need to prove he was dangerous. Everyone already knew. What he needed to prove, what he did prove, was that he could choose to be merciful and still remain powerful. That he could de-escalate without losing face. That he could protect his family and his community without turning the streets into a war zone. And that proof changed everything. It gave him a kind of authority that couldn't be bought, couldn't be stolen, couldn't be replicated, a moral authority. The kind that makes people follow you, not because they fear you, but because they respect you, because they believe you'll do the right thing, even when the easy thing is available. And in Harlem, in a community that had been exploited, disrespected, and brutalized for generations, that kind of leadership was revolutionary. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just running a criminal enterprise. He was running a counter system, a way of operating that said, we don't have to accept the rules they gave us. We can make our own. We can create order in the chaos. We can protect ourselves without becoming the thing we're fighting against. And the Vincent Cole moment was the perfect distillation of that philosophy. It was Bumpy saying, I could destroy you, but I'm choosing something better. Now, and that choice, that restraint, became his signature. Other gangsters didn't understand it. They saw Bumpy's reluctance to escalate as weakness. They thought he was soft, past his prime, too concerned with politics and community relations to do what needed to be done. They were wrong. And the ones who tested that assumption learned quickly. Because Bumpy's restraint wasn't hesitation, it was calculation. He didn't avoid violence because he was afraid of it. He avoided it because it was inefficient. Every body brought heat. Every shooting brought police. Every public execution brought questions, investigations, pressure from City Hall. And all of that disrupted business. Bumpy understood what most criminals didn't. The goal wasn't to be the toughest man in the room. It was to control the room. And you couldn't control a room full of corpses. You controlled it by making people understand the rules, by enforcing consequences that were proportional and predictable, by creating a system where everyone knew what would happen if they stepped out of line. Vincent Cole stepped out of line, and Bumpy showed him, and everyone watching, exactly what that cost. Not his life, his dignity. And for a man trying to build a reputation, dignity was everything. Without it, he was nothing. Just another forgotten soldier in someone else's war. That's what Bumpy had sentenced him to. Not death, irrelevance. And that sentence was permanent. The respect Bumpy earned from that moment extended far beyond Harlem. Downtown, the Italian families took notice. They'd been testing Bumpy for years, trying to figure out if he could be intimidated, bought, or eliminated. The Vincent Cole incident answered all three questions at once. No, Bumpy Johnson couldn't be moved. Not by threats, not by money, not by force, because he operated from a position of principle. And principle, when backed by competence and community support, was unbreakable. The Italians had power. They had connections, money, political influence, but they didn't have what Bumpy had, legitimacy in his own territory. Harlem didn't just tolerate Bumpy. Harlem wanted him, because he'd proven time and time again that he would protect them, that he'd stand between them and outside threats, that he'd keep the neighborhood stable, functional, and theirs. And you couldn't buy that kind of loyalty. You couldn't intimidate it into existence. You had to earn it. Bumpy had been earning it for decades. Every fair ruling in a dispute. Every favor granted to someone in need. Every outside crew pushed back without collateral damage. All of it built equity. And by 1946, Bumpy's equity in Harlem was so deep, so unshakable, that challenging him wasn't just dangerous, it was pointless. Because even if you killed him, the system would remain. The loyalty would remain. The community would remain. And they would remember what you did. That's what Sal Moretti realized when he pulled his people out. That's what Vincent Cole realized when he knelt on that pavement. That's what every crew from Brooklyn to the Bronx understood after the story spread. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just protected by guns and muscle. He was protected by belief. And belief doesn't die when a man dies. It becomes legend. It becomes legacy. And in the years that followed, Bumpy's reputation only grew. The story of Vincent Cole became one of dozens. Stories of Bumpy outsmarting the police, outmaneuvering rival crews, protecting the vulnerable, upholding principles even when it cost him. Each story reinforced the same message. This man is different. He doesn't play by the usual rules. He doesn't chase violence for its own sake. He uses it like a surgeon's scalpel, only when necessary, only with precision, only to solve a specific problem. And the rest of the time, he builds, he invests, he organizes, he creates systems that last. That's what separated Bumpy from the hundreds of other gangsters who came and went. They built empires on sand. Bumpy built his on stone. And when the winds came, when law enforcement cracked down, when rivals pushed back, when the neighborhood faced external threats, Bumpy's foundation held. Because it wasn't built on fear. It was built on trust. Trust that he would handle things the right way. Trust that violence would be the last resort, not the first. Trust that the community's interests would always come before his ego. And trust, once earned at that level, is nearly impossible to break. Mamie Johnson understood this better than anyone. She'd been there that day on Lenox Avenue, not physically, but in every other way that mattered. She knew her husband had options. He could have had Vincent killed quietly, could have made an example that no one would ever forget. But he chose something harder. He chose to be public with his restraint, to show the neighborhood and the world that you could be powerful without being cruel, and that you could demand respect without drowning the streets in blood. That strength wasn't about destruction. It was about discipline. And Mamie saw how that choice rippled outward, how it changed the way people looked at Bumpy, how it elevated him from gangster to statesman, how it turned him into something more than a criminal. He became a symbol of what was possible when you rejected the easy path, of what you could build when you prioritized the long game over short-term satisfaction, of what leadership actually looked like when it was rooted in something deeper than ego. She watched him carry that weight for years, watched him make the hard calls, the unpopular decisions, the choices that kept the peace, but cost him personally. And she understood why people followed him, not because they were afraid, so because they believed. They believed he was building something bigger than himself, something that would outlast him, something that mattered. By the time Bumpy Johnson passed in 1968, Harlem had changed. The numbers game had been absorbed by the state lottery. The streets had shifted. A new generation had arrived with new ideas and new enemies. But the lessons remained. The stories remained. And the name Bumpy Johnson remained. Not as a cautionary tale, as an ideal. People still talked about the way he handled business, the way he never let anger make his decisions, the way he protected the neighborhood without treating it like property, the way he turned restraint into power. And in those conversations, the story of Vincent Cole always came up, because it captured everything Bumpy stood for in a single moment. No, the discipline, the strategy, the moral clarity. The understanding that real power isn't about domination. It's about influence. And influence, the kind that lasts, the kind that changes how people think and act, can't be taken by force. It has to be earned. Bumpy Johnson spent his entire life earning it. And the proof wasn't in how many people feared him. It was in how many people trusted him. How many came to him for advice, for mediation, for protection. How many stood by him when the law came calling? How many refused to cooperate with investigations, even under pressure, because they believed Bumpy was worth protecting? That's legacy. Not what you take, what you leave behind. And what Bumpy left behind was a blueprint, a way of thinking about power that most people in his world never understood. That power without restraint is just chaos. That fear without respect is just tyranny. That violence without purpose is just destruction. He showed a generation of young men in Harlem and beyond that you could be strong without being cruel, that you could be feared without being hated, that you could control a neighborhood without owning it, and that the longest-lasting empires aren't built on bodies. They're built on principles. Vincent Cole never returned to New York. He lived out his days in Philadelphia, working low-level jobs, never rising, never recovering. The story followed him. People knew, and everywhere he went, He carried the weight of that moment on Lenox Avenue. The moment he knelt, the moment he broke, the moment he learned that some men don't need to kill you to end you. Hey, they just need to show the world who you really are. And Bumpy Johnson had shown the world exactly who Vincent Cole was. A man who thought power came from violence. A man who confused aggression with authority. A man who didn't understand that the hardest thing to do, the thing that separates legends from footnotes, is knowing when not to pull the trigger. Bumpy understood that. He lived it. And in living it, he created something that lasted long after he was gone. Not an empire, a legacy. The kind of legacy that gets passed down in stories, the kind that shapes how people think about leadership, about power, about what it means to be strong, the kind that makes a man immortal. Not because of what he destroyed, because of what he built, and what Bumpy Johnson built. On the streets of Harlem, in the hearts of a community, high in the minds of everyone who heard his story, was something no law enforcement agency could take down, no rival crew could dismantle, no passage of time could erase. He built a standard, and that standard, forged in moments like the one on Lenox Avenue in 1946, became the measuring stick for every man who came after. They all asked themselves the same question: what would Bumpy do? And the answer was always the same. Not the easy thing, not the loud thing, not the violent thing, the right thing, the thing that solved the problem without creating 10 more, the thing that protected the community without sacrificing its soul, the thing that proved you didn't need to be a monster to survive in a world full of them. You just needed to be disciplined, calm, certain, untouchable. That was Bumpy Johnson. That was his legacy. Heck, and that, more than any empire, more than any fortune, more than any body count, is why his name still echoes through Harlem today. Not as a ghost, as a reminder. That power, real power, doesn't come from what you can destroy. It comes from what you choose not to. And in that choice, that singular, public, unforgettable choice, Bumpy Johnson proved he was more than a gangster. He was a king, the kind that doesn't need a crown, just a reputation, and a room full of people who believed.